The snow came down fine as flour, dusting the world in a silent, creeping white. By the time I got my boots on the porch of my cabin, the whole prairie was gone, buried under a blanket of pewter gray and cold. The wind had teeth and it bit at my cheeks, reminding me I was a small thing in a very big, empty world. A reminder I didn't need. I'd been living with that feeling for years. Inside, the cabin was just 4 log walls and the dying orange breath of a hearth. The silence in there was louder than the wind outside. It was a heavy, thick thing, the kind of quiet that gets in your bones. Loneliness wasn't just a feeling, it was a coat I wore day in and day out, and the seams were starting to wear thin. That morning in town, the silence hadn't been mine, it had belonged to them. The whispers that followed me like stray dogs, the stares that felt like little stones hitting my back. Martha Holloway, her voice like cracking ice, loud enough for everyone to hear. "What kind of woman lives alone like that? It ain't natural." Her words stuck to me, colder than the snow on my cloak. I'd walked away with my chin up, but my throat was burning. 26 years old, and they treated me like I was a piece of spoiled fruit left too long on the vine. It all started with Elias Boone. He'd courted me for a time, all smiles and confidence. Then one day he just turned, said I was too proud, too strange. His words were the nail in my coffin. After that, I was the woman nobody wanted, the woman nobody chose. The town had made up its mind, and my fate was sealed. That night, the snow got thicker, beating against the shutters like a restless spirit. I got up to bar the door, to shut the world out for good, and I froze. Through the swirl of white, I saw them. 2 figures. At first I thought they were just twisted pines, but then they moved. They were giants. Tall and broad, draped in hides, with hair as white as the blizzard raging around them. Their faces were maps of time and hardship, but they stood with a kind of dignity that seemed to push back against the storm itself. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Apaches, the old stories my father used to tell, of raids and fear flashed through my mind. Those days were long gone, but seeing them there, on my doorstep, felt like seeing ghosts walk out of the snow. One of them took a step forward. His voice was low, tired, but clear even through the wind. "We ask only one night." The other one stood behind him, a mountain of a man, his eyes catching the firelight from my window. They were carved from the prairie itself, worn down but not broken. The storm had dusted their shoulders, making them seem ancient. My first thought was the town. Martha, Elias, what they would say. The whispers would turn into shouts. This wouldn't just be shame, this would be ruin. But then another thought, sharp and clear, cut through the fear. I knew what it felt like to have a door shut in your face. My hand trembled on the wooden bar. Outside, 2 strangers waited, with snow in their hair and exhaustion in their bones. "Please," the first one said. That one word carried the weight of 1,000 miles, of hunger, of pride brought low by desperation. I pulled the door open. The cold rushed in, a physical blow. For a long moment we just stood there, my eyes meeting theirs, the storm a swirling curtain around us. Then, I stepped aside. They entered the cabin not like men seeking shelter, but like priests entering a sacred place. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace that made the small room feel even smaller. The air grew heavy, thick with their presence and the smell of wet hides and pine. One, the taller one with a scar that cut a lightning bolt down his cheek, lowered himself by the fire. He moved with a careful restraint, as if he was afraid his sheer size might shatter my rickety furniture. The other, broader and built like an old oak, stood by the door, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on the flames. My hands started moving before my brain could tell them what to do. I threw another log on the fire, the sparks flying up like angry hornets. I set 2 tin cups on the rough-hewn table. I laid out the last of my bread. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. We didn't exchange names. It didn't seem necessary. The silence that fell between us was different from the lonely quiet I was used to. This silence was full of stories, of histories I couldn't possibly imagine. It was a silence that had weight. I sat across from them, my hands clasped in my lap, and for the first time in years, I wasn't alone. The loneliness was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but it had shifted. It was no longer just mine. I watched their faces in the firelight, the deep lines, the white hair that looked like spun moonlight, the weariness that clung to them like the snow. They didn't look at me with pity, not like the women in town. They didn't look at me with judgment, not like Elias Boone. Their gaze was heavy, calm, the look of men who had seen the world and found it wanting. The storm outside howled, piling snow against the door, burying my little cabin deeper and deeper. The town, with its sharp-edged whispers and cruel smirks, felt 1,000,000 miles away. But its voices were still there, ghosts in the corner of my mind, promising what would happen if anyone found out. The broader man, the one who moved like a slow river, reached into his cloak. He pulled out a small object and set it gently on the table. It was a wooden carving of a bird, its wing chipped, the wood worn smooth by countless hands. He didn't say a word, but the gesture was a story in itself. Something precious. Something that had survived. I stared at the bird, then at his scarred hands, and I felt the fire crackle between us, a living thing. The night grew darker, pressing in on the little cabin, but the light inside seemed to glow brighter, a single defiant spark in a world of white. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I didn't know what the morning would bring. Gossip, suspicion, maybe worse. But as I leaned into the warmth of the fire, watching the shadows of these two giants dance on the walls, I knew one thing for sure. I had already made my choice. A different kind of storm was brewing, not of snow, but of defiance, and it was just getting started. The fire hissed and popped, a lonely conversation in the dead of the night. I sat on my stool, feeling like a stranger in my own home. The two men hadn't moved much. The taller one, the one with the lightning bolt scar, knelt by the hearth, his long white hair falling over his shoulders. The broader one was a statue against the far wall, as if he was holding the cabin up with his sheer presence. I studied their hands. The broader one flexed his fingers, and I saw the thin white lines of old scars crisscrossing his knuckles. These were hands that had known conflict, that had fought and held on. The taller one spoke first, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting deep in the earth. "We bring no trouble," he said, his dark eyes fixed on me. He held his hands up, palms open. "Only the storm." I found my voice, though it felt thin and reedy. "The storm can kill you just as dead as a bullet." He dipped his head in a slow nod. He already knew. The broader man finally spoke, his voice rough, like gravel. "We have walked a long way. Many doors were closed to us." He didn't need to say whose doors, white doors, town doors. A familiar ache tightened in my chest. I knew all about closed doors. Elias Boone had slammed the most important one right in my face, and the whole town had followed his lead, locking me out with their stares and their whispers. Shame, I was learning, didn't care about the color of your skin. It was a universal language. I got up and put more bread on the table. They watched me move, their eyes following every step, but they didn't reach for it. "Eat," I said, my voice stronger this time. They ate slowly, respectfully, with the quiet focus of men who knew what real hunger felt like. It was different from the loud, careless way the men in town ate, their laughter booming, their manners an afterthought. These men carried themselves with a discipline that even exhaustion couldn't erase. As the cabin warmed, words began to surface, small fragments of their story. The taller one, Chaitin spoke of rivers that had changed their course, of lands that were shrinking. The broader one, Takakota, mentioned a wife, gone many winters ago, his voice catching on the memory. I listened. For years, my own story had felt like it was happening in a vacuum. Tonight, I could feel the weight of their stories pressing against mine, and the room felt a little less empty. My eyes fell on the carved bird again. I reached out and let my fingers trace the chipped wing. Yours? Takakota nodded. Made for me, a long time ago. His eyes held a universe of loss. The wind picked up again, rattling the roof. In its rhythm, I felt a strange sense of connection to these two men. We were all scarred, one way or another. Theirs were on the outside, for the world to see. Mine were on the inside, hidden away. But they had all been carved by the same cruel tool: rejection. The thought of the town came rushing back. If anyone saw them here, the rumors would become fact. My name would be mud, thicker and dirtier than ever before. Chaitin seemed to read my mind. He leaned forward, his dark eyes steady. You fear them, he said. It wasn't a question. I fear what they can take from me, I whispered, my jaw tight. He nodded slowly. They already have. The truth of his words hit me like a physical blow. He was right. My reputation, my chance at a normal life, my sense of belonging, all of it had been stripped away by whispers and one man's pride. What more was there to lose? Takakota's voice rumbled from the shadows. A fire cannot hide its smoke, he said, his gaze on the flames, but it still gives warmth. I stared into the fire, my eyes stinging. For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackling logs and the moaning wind. A tiny ember of defiance began to glow in my chest. I had let them define me for too long. In these two strangers, I saw what it meant to be despised but not defeated. And then, through the howl of the storm, I heard it. A different sound. Faint at first, then clearer. Voices, men's voices, carried on the wind. My blood ran cold. I shot a look toward the door. The two men went perfectly still, their bodies tensed, listening. The fire flickered, casting their shadows up against the walls, making them look like ancient, avenging spirits. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm. The cabin, which had felt like a sanctuary moments before, now felt like a trap made of glass. Chaitin's hand rested on the small wooden bird, his fingers steady, but his eyes were locked on mine. He didn't look afraid. He looked like a man who knew a storm was coming, and this time it had nothing to do with the weather. The next morning, the world was silent, wrapped in a thick blanket of fresh snow. I rose before the sun, the air in the cabin so cold my breath plumed in front of my face. I made coffee, the bitter smell a small comfort. I set 2 cups before Chaitin and Takakota, who accepted them with silent nods. That should have been the end of it. A night of shelter, a polite departure at dawn. But when I pulled on my shawl to head into town for supplies, they rose to their feet. They didn't ask to come. I didn't invite them. But as I stepped out into the blinding white, they fell into step behind me, 2 silent, towering shadows. The walk to town was a struggle, our boots sinking deep into the drifts. The moment we hit the main street, everything changed. It was like a switch had been flipped. Conversations stuttered and died. Porch swings creaked to a halt. Every single eye turned to us, 100 little points of suspicion and contempt. I could feel their stares on my skin, sharp as needles. Martha Holloway was standing on the mercantile porch, her face pinched with malice. "Well, would you look at that?" she said, her voice carrying across the street like a screech owl's cry. "Seems Miss Amelia's finally found some company. Had to scrape the bottom of the barrel to do it, though." A wave of cruel laughter followed, brittle and sharp. My face burned with shame. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, but I heard every word. Inside the mercantile, It was even worse. Mr. Garrison measured out my flour with a grim expression, his eyes darting to Chayton and Takakota, who stood like stone statues by the door. "You be careful, Amelia," he muttered, just loud enough for the other customers to hear. "That kind of company ain't fit for a decent woman." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them they knew nothing, that these men had shown me more decency in one night than this whole town had shown me in years. But my throat was tight with unshed tears. My truth didn't matter here. Theirs was the only one that counted. When I stepped back outside, he was there. Elias Boone. Blocking my path, his arms crossed over his broad chest, a familiar, mocking smirk on his face. "I always knew you were proud, Amelia," he said, his eyes sweeping over Chayton and Takakota with open disgust. "But to bring them into town, parading them around like some kind of freak show, you have no shame at all." The basket in my hand felt impossibly heavy. I remembered a time when his gaze had made me feel warm. Now it just made me feel sick. Takakota shifted behind me, a subtle movement, but it was enough. It was a silent promise of support, and it sent a sliver of steel up my spine. "Get out of my way, Elias," I said. My voice trembled, but it was there. He laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Careful, Amelia. People are talking, and once they start, they don't ever stop." I pushed past him, my heart hammering against my ribs. The whole walk back to the cabin, I could feel the town's eyes on me, their whispers following me like a plague. Disgrace, shameless, ruined. Back inside, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely set the basket down. The whispers had always hurt, but this was different. This was a deeper wound. They were shaming me not just for being alone, but for being kind. I buried my face in my hands, my shoulders shaking. "They'll never let me live this down," I choked out. Chayton was by the window, watching the snow fall. "Their words are just wind," he said, his voice calm and steady. "And wind can't put out a fire." "Their words have ruined me before," I sobbed. He turned, and his dark eyes were like polished stones. "Only because you let them." Takakota added more wood to the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. "We have lived our whole lives with words sharper than any knife," he rumbled, "and yet we are still here." Their strength was a thing of beauty, a defiance I desperately wanted for myself. But it felt a million miles away. As the day wore on, I replayed every sneer, every hateful word. The shame was a cold, heavy thing in the pit of my stomach. By late afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood by the door, staring out at the endless white. "You can't stay here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "If they see you again." Chayton came to stand beside me. "We do not stay where we are not wanted." His tone wasn't angry, just matter of fact. Something inside me broke. "It's not that I don't want you," I cried, the words tumbling out. "It's them, and I'm not strong enough to stand up to them all." Takakota looked up from the fire. "Strength is not standing alone," he said. "It is standing at all, even when you are afraid." I looked from his scarred face to Chayton's, and I saw it, the possibility of a different kind of strength. The town could hurt me, yes. They could whisper and point and sneer. But the deepest cuts were the ones I'd been giving myself, by believing I was everything they said I was. Just as that thought settled in my mind, I saw them. Faint lights, bobbing in the distance. Lanterns, a lot of them, moving through the snow, coming this way. My heart leaped into my throat. The men saw them too. Chayton's body went rigid, Takakota's jaw set like granite. They exchanged a look, a silent communication that spoke of years of shared struggle. The storm of gossip was over. A real storm was about to break right on my doorstep. The wind came back with a scream, throwing fists of snow against the cabin. Inside, the fire roared, a beast of orange and red, casting our shadows long and distorted against the log walls. My pulse, was a frantic, terrified beat against the howl of the storm. The lanterns grew closer, a string of angry fireflies weaving through the blizzard. They were coming for a reckoning. They were coming to cast out the strangers and put me back in my place. "They're coming," I whispered, the words getting lost in the noise. Chayton stood by the window, a silhouette of grim resolve. "You fear their eyes," he stated, his voice a low counterpoint to the wind's shriek. "I fear their power," I admitted, my own voice trembling. "They decide who belongs and who doesn't. And they decided about me a long time ago." Takakota rose from the hearth, his huge frame seeming to suck all the air out of the room. "Belonging is a cage," he rumbled. "Better to be free." His words were wise, but freedom felt like a distant dream. All I could picture was Martha Holloway's smug face, Elias Boone's cruel smile. They wouldn't just cast me out, they would grind me into the dirt, and these two men, my unlikely protectors, would be the cause of my final destruction. Chayton moved from the window. He picked up the small carved bird from the table and pressed it into my hand. The wood was smooth and cool against my sweaty palm. "Hold this," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "It has seen worse storms than this one." I closed my fingers around it, a fragile anchor in a sea of fear. I looked up into his eyes, and for a second, the terror receded. But then the voices came, clear and sharp on the wind. Shouts, angry and ugly. "They'll break the door down," I gasped. Takakota took his place beside Chayton. "Then they will find us waiting." He glanced at his friend, and a whole lifetime of understanding passed between them in that single look. My own life seemed to flash before my eyes. Every lonely meal, every averted gaze in town, every night spent listening to the silence. They were about to force me to make a choice. Would I side with the town that despised me, or with the strangers who had shown me a flicker of respect? The first blow on the door was like a gunshot. It shook the entire cabin. I flinched, my grip on the carving tightening until my knuckles were white. Another blow. Then his voice, unmistakable, dripping with malice. "Amelia, open up! We've come to see your pets!" "Elias." My stomach churned. The shame was a hot flush on my skin, but something else was there too, a cold, hard knot of anger. Chayton's voice was quiet beside me. "This is your door. Your choice." Another series of blows, harder this time. "Come on out, you shameful woman. We won't have your kind dirtying up this town." Their words were like claws, tearing at the thin fabric of my composure. I wanted to curl up in a ball and disappear, but I couldn't. Something had shifted inside me. I had been bent for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. I walked to the door. My hand was shaking, but I lifted the heavy wooden bar. I pulled the door open. A blast of snow and wind roared into the cabin. The lantern light was blinding, painting the faces of the mob in grotesque masks of shadow and light. Elias was at the front, a triumphant sneer on his face. Behind him, the men of the town, their expressions an ugly mix of hatred and fear. "There's your proof," Elias shouted, pointing a finger at me. "Sheltering them. I told you she was nothing but trash." I stood there, trembling, the wind whipping my hair across my face. I could feel the solid presence of Chayton and Takakota behind me, two pillars of silent strength. Their courage flowed into me. My voice was shaky, but it carried over the wind. I gave them shelter from the storm. If that's a crime, then I am guilty. Elias laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Listen to her. She'd rather stand with savages than her own people." My own people. They had never been my people. The thought gave me a strange sense of clarity. My chin came up. "They are better men than you will ever be, Elias Boone." The words hung in the air, a shocking, undeniable truth. A stunned silence fell over the mob. Elias's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of pure rage. The other men shuffled their feet, their certainty beginning to crumble. Just then, Sheriff Amos pushed his way to the front. His face was lined with weariness. He looked at me, then at the two silent figures behind me, then at the angry mob. He let out a long sigh. "This ain't right," he said, his voice tired but firm. "Go on home, all of you." There were grumbles of protest, but the sheriff rested his hand on the butt of his pistol, and the argument died. One by one, they turned away, their lanterns bobbing back into the darkness. Elias was the last to leave. He shot me a look of pure hatred, spat in the snow, and disappeared into the storm. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, my chest heaving, the cold biting at my skin. Then I closed the door and slid the bar back into place. My legs gave out, and I sagged against the wall, the carved bird clutched to my chest. Tears streamed down my face, hot and cleansing. Tears of fear, yes, but also tears of release. I had stood my ground. I had spoken my truth. Takakota placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, a gesture of quiet comfort. Chaitan just watched me, his dark eyes holding something I couldn't quite decipher. Respect, maybe. The fire crackled, a warm and steady heartbeat in the suddenly quiet cabin. The storm outside was still raging, but the storm inside me had finally broken. And in the calm that followed, I had a terrifying thought. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The morning brought a false peace. The snow had stopped, and the world outside was a pristine, unbroken white. But the silence in the cabin was different now. It was the tense, watchful quiet of soldiers waiting for the next battle. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the hate on Elias's face. I knew he wouldn't let it go. Men like him never did. Their pride was a fragile, brittle thing, and I had shattered it. Near dawn, just as a pale, watery light began to seep through the window, we heard it. The crunch of many boots on frozen snow, the metallic click of rifles being cocked. They were back. Takakota was on his feet in an instant, a silent, menacing tower of a man. Chaitan's face was a mask of grim acceptance. He had known this was coming. "They mean to drive you out," I whispered, my heart a cold stone in my chest. "And me with you." "Then we will not be driven," Chaitan said, his voice flat and hard. The first blow on the door was heavier this time, splintering the wood. Elias's voice boomed, full of rage. "This ends now, Amelia. You choose, us or them." My whole body was trembling, a leaf in the wind. But my mind was strangely calm. He was asking me to choose my place. But they had already chosen it for me years ago. I was the outcast, the strange one, the woman who didn't fit. And for the first time, I didn't care. I turned to face Chaitan and Takakota. They were my people now. "I won't make you leave," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Not now, not ever." A rare, fleeting smile touched Takakota's lips. Chaitan simply inclined his head, a gesture of profound respect. The mob outside was roaring, their shouts a senseless wave of hatred. "Let's end this," Elias screamed. I took a deep breath. My hand was steady as I lifted the bar. I threw the door open. The pale morning light flooded in, stark and unforgiving. The yard was full of them, a small army of angry men, their faces twisted with fear and ignorance. Elias stood at the front, his eyes blazing with a righteous fury that was wholly unearned. "You disgrace us all!" he yelled. I stepped out onto the porch, the frigid air a shock to my lungs. I didn't even feel the cold. Chaitan and Takakota flanked me, their silent dignity a more powerful weapon than any rifle. I lifted my chin. "If kindness is a disgrace," I called out, my voice ringing in the crisp air, "then I am proud to be disgraceful. If giving shelter to men in need makes me shameful, then I will wear that shame like a badge of honor." I looked directly at Elias, all my years of buried anger fueling my words. "You cast me out a long time ago, Elias Boone. You don't get to define me now." A gasp went through the crowd. This was not the timid, broken Amelia they were used to. This was someone else entirely. Elias's face turned a blotchy red. He took a step toward me, his hand raised. And then Chayton moved. He didn't touch Elias. He didn't have to. He simply stepped in front of me, a silent, immovable mountain. His stare was so intense, so full of ancient power, that Elias actually stumbled back a step. Takakota moved to his other side, and together they formed a living wall. The sheriff pushed his way through the crowd again, his face etched with desperation. "Enough!" he shouted. "Go home, before this goes too far!" But this time, the mob wasn't listening. They were a wild beast, whipped into a frenzy by Elias's hate. "They're not human!" someone shouted from the back. "They're animals!" "And she's no better!" Martha Holloway screeched from the edge of the crowd. That was when I saw it. The small, dark object in Elias's hand. A pistol. He was raising it, aiming it not at the two men, but at me. Time seemed to slow down. I saw the flash of his eyes, the tightening of his finger on the trigger. I was going to die. But before he could fire, a new voice cut through the air. A woman's voice. Old, frail, but sharp as a razor. "Elias Boone, you put that down right now." The crowd parted, and a tiny, stooped figure hobbled forward, leaning heavily on a cane. It was Elspeth, the town's oldest resident, a woman so ancient everyone assumed she was half ghost already. No one ever crossed Elspeth. She hobbled right up to Elias and, without a word of warning, whacked him hard on the shin with her cane. He yelped in pain and surprise, his aim wavering. "You're a fool, Elias Boone," she rasped, her voice cracking with age but ringing with authority. "A bigger fool than your father, and I didn't think that was possible." She turned her rheumy eyes on me and then on Chayton and Takakota. A flicker of something I couldn't read passed across her face. "These men," she said, her voice dropping, "did they happen to show you a small carved bird?" My heart stopped. I slowly opened my hand, revealing the wooden bird. Elspeth nodded, a grim satisfaction on her wrinkled face. She turned back to the stunned crowd. 30 years ago," she began, her voice gaining strength, "a great sickness swept through this valley. It was the Apache who brought us the medicine that saved our children, including Elias's own mother." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. "Their leader," Elspeth continued, pointing a bony finger at the bird in my hand, "carved that himself. He gave it to my husband as a sign of peace, a promise that we would help them in return should they ever need it." She turned her fiery gaze on Elias. "A promise your father broke when he stole their winter lands for himself. These men haven't come here for trouble. They've come for justice." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the cawing of a distant crow. Every eye was now on Elias, but it wasn't admiration in their gazes anymore. It was doubt and dawning horror. Elias looked trapped, his face a mask of panic. "She's a crazy old woman. She doesn't know what she's talking about." But his voice lacked conviction. The sheriff stepped forward, his face hard. "Is this true, Elias?" Elias started to bluster, to deny, but Chayton spoke for the first time, his voice a low, powerful thunder that rolled over the silent crowd. "The land was stolen. The treaty was broken. Your town was built on a lie." He looked at the sheriff. "The proof is in the town records, a deed forged by Elias Boone's father." The sheriff's face went pale. He knew. He must have known all along. He had been complicit in the lie. Suddenly the whole story was clear. My father. He must have found out. That's why Elias had turned on me. He was afraid I knew his family's secret. He hadn't just rejected me. He'd been trying to silence me, to discredit me, so that if I ever did speak up, no one would believe me. The whole town had been a pawn in his sick game. Elias, seeing the tide turning against him, made a desperate move. He grabbed Martha Holloway's husband, holding him as a shield, and started backing away toward the woods. "Don't anyone follow me!" he screamed, his eyes wild with terror. But Takakota was already moving, not with speed, but with a relentless, unstoppable force, like a glacier. He didn't run, he just walked, and the crowd parted before him like the Red Sea. The confrontation was over in seconds. Takakota disarmed Elias with a single, fluid motion, and the sheriff, shamed into action, finally put the cuffs on him. As Elias was led away, shouting and cursing, the townspeople couldn't even look at me. Their faces were a mixture of shame and disbelief. They had been so sure of their righteousness, so quick to judge, and they had been wrong, so horribly wrong. Chaitin and Takakota stood beside me, the morning sun glinting off their white hair. They hadn't come for revenge. They had come for the truth. And with a little help from a forgotten old woman and a disgraced outcast, they had found it. The snow-covered prairie looked different now. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt clean. It felt like a new beginning. My little cabin, once a prison of loneliness, was now a fortress of defiance. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I truly belonged. Not to the town, but to myself. And that was more than enough. If you were moved by this story of courage and unexpected friendship, hit that subscribe button. You never know what other secrets are buried just beneath the surface.